Hello, I'm here with Brad Wilkins, who's a VP of People at Cognite. And before that, he was building out people functions at LoadSmart, Calibra, and Altisource, taking that last one from a few hundred people to a public company with over 7,000 employees. He's also spent time on the investing side. So he's been in the workforce decisions for both the boardroom and the HRC. What I want to get into today is what actually happens when a company scales fast and then has to contract because people aren't honest about these parts and they end up having to reduce. Before we get into all of that, I'd like to welcome Brad to the show. So, Brad, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, how you came to be, and what you do?
Awesome. Hey, Gerald, really excited to be here. As you pointed out, a lot of times you jump on these shows or you go to conferences and they're filled with buzzwords and pretense and vendors, and so it's nice to just kind of be in a more casual spot, filled with books. It seems as well. And so as we're overflowing on all sides, my name is Brad, and my background is kind of in human capital. I've always kind of been a business first person that uses human capital as the vehicle. It's funny, even still today, HR people say, "Oh, I want a seat at the table." And for as long as I can remember, I've always say, "Stop asking for a seat at the table. Have a dinner party. People will come to your place." Right. And I was lucky. The first role out of college, I was working for a COO. I was doing kind of what. Again, I started in kind of training and then got into recruiting and then compensation. And it kind of kept taking on all these different talent functions at a scale up company. And I was employee 17. We ended up going over 1,000 people. And the whole time I never was working for an HR person. I was working for a business person. And so accidentally I was doing business centric talent, not because that's what I was trained to do. It's because that's the only thing I knew how to do, right? I wasn't being told by an HR person what to do. And so it was really accidentally, as fast forward almost 20 years now, that created such an imprint on the beginning of my career that it feeds through almost everything I do here today. To your point, I've been, at a seed stage companies helping to build founding teams where three people, and I've been the chief people officer of a $1 billion publicly traded company. And so they all have similarities and different challenges along the way. But the thing that makes them all most exciting is human capital is this kind of imperfect beast. It's this kind of Quixotean challenge, right? Where we're kind of trying to increase probability to certainty, knowing it's impossible, right?
Right.
We know that no matter what we do, no matter how many kind of perfections we try to put in our programs and processes, there's things that are externalities that are completely outside of our control. And we know that, right? And yet we still go to work every single day trying to increase the probability towards this certainty that we know is impossible. And that's always been the fun thing to me is this, unlike coding, where if I put enough zeros and ones in there, we know that it will eventually spit out the thing that my zero and ones say will, and whatever, say, not zeros and ones anymore, but the code will spit out what it's supposed to spit out.
Yeah.
Humans, unfortunately, aren't that predictable. And that's actually what makes it fun to me. So,
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the age of AI, all of that really comes into play because I think understanding how we as humans interact with one another and get things done is not
right.
something a machine can do. So to me, it seems like you are ahead of your time being able to focus on people from that perspective. However, I want to jump into something that you said that when you first started out working with the COO, what was that relationship like when you are looking at it from the lens of business and people? And what were the things you were thinking about when you had your first role, especially working at the C level at the beginning of your career?
Yeah. I mean, so very accidentally, right? So I was originally hired. So in university, I was originally was a dual major in business and theater. I was never going to do theater as a profession. It was kind of a hobby I'd done in high school. And I was like, oh, I'll keep doing it in college. But I found myself gravitating more in the theater department towards things that felt more relevant. So I grew up with two parents that were CEOs. As a kid, I just, without getting too down this rabbit hole, but we did foster care as a kid. And so there were normally 8 to 10 kids in my house at any given point. And so if I wanted one-on-one time with my parents, I actually went to their office. And so as a child, I was a business geek, right? Like when I was 10 years old, my favorite book was What They Don't Teach You at Harvard Business School. And by the time I got to college, right, the business stuff was kind of vocabulary. It was kind of boring. Where I was gravitating towards in the theater department wasn't what people are like, oh, theater degree, that made you a great public speaker. Like, sure. But what I was actually finding was it was more about kind of empathy, about creativity, about kind of working together towards this uniformity. When you take, and I did more directing than acting. If you know anything about the theater, you take a scenic designer, a lighting designer, a costume designer, the actors kind of collectively towards this finite thing, a script, right? How do you allow each of them to showcase themselves and yet they're all looking at the script through their own unique lens? Ironically, that's very similar to HR. How do you take a product team and an engineering team and the finance team? All obviously toward the same uniform goal, and how do you make everyone look good and get to showcase themselves even though they have their own conflicting kind of goals and allow themselves to showcase, right? And so I actually ended up finishing my theater degree because I found that to be much more applicable for what I knew I wanted to do in the business world, right? Yeah, coming out of school, that led to a training job, right? Because theater trainer, right? And so I was originally doing training of customers, and then I kind of on the side was training new employees, right? Because we were so small. But then I'd train new employees about, you know, hey, this Gerald guy, he's really good. And then, this Bob guy, hey, he's not paying attention. He's missing on these, subtle nuances on pattern recognition, just little tangents of things. And so I was right. Play it out a few times. Like, right, we're getting Brad's opinion way too late in this, right? And so then they're like, oh, we need to get Brad into it sooner. And so then I got into the recruiting side. It's like, oh, why should I work here? Why should I work here? And this is, kind of peak good to great years, get the right people on the bus, right? So then I kind of got into like, let's figure out how do we build a culture? How do we understand kind of compensation? What are the drivers? And again, connecting all these like compensation, connecting to the financial metrics, right? Not just like throwing, to the wind, right? Again, I didn't know what the Hay methodology was or any of the stuff that, later in my career, I obviously understood it from a kind of a more pedagogical standpoint. And so it really was like, hey, if I need to attract the right talent or build the right job description to actually achieve the business results, right? And so it was all so taught connected on this side. Whereas again, most HR practitioners, they begin over here and then they have to like take whatever their construct is, job families or whatever the structured things that they've been trained on, and then like how do I cram that into the business? I actually had the opposite problem. I was like, hey, how do I take the business stuff and then cram it into
Mm.
something that makes sense in HR? 2 roles later in my career, when I got to a small company called AdCap, when we had a problem with attracting kind of top tier sales talent, one of the things I said immediately is like, hey, we could go and build it. And again, you can build versus buy. And, obviously one of the big topics you wanted to talk about today was scaling. And, they wanted to scale faster and they just had a complete revolving door around sales talent, right? They had kind of 4 top salespeople and then the rest just kind of rotating in and out of the door. And so I said, hey, how do we at an accelerated pace move people through? And so we built an apprentice program with this acronym that I built called CLEAR. And CLEAR was this financially driven, quarterly based automatic career progression program. And
Wow.
it's an acronym for Clear Career Path, Learning Objectives, Expectations, Accountabilities, and Rewards. And it's something we started on the sales side for a BDR, business development rep. And essentially, you started as a business development rep one. You knew exactly what was the next stage of your career path. BDR two, your learning objectives. What were the certifications you needed to hit to be a BDR two and a BDR three? What were your expectations, your accountabilities, X number of deals closed? And then let's say you started at, I don't remember the number, 45K to move to 50K. That was your reward for getting to BDR2, right? And so it was completely automatically progressed into it. And it all tied into FP&A because essentially I could go to FP&A and be like, hey, if I knew with absolute certainty, which I did, that I had someone generating this much in sales revenue and they had this knowledge that I was able to validate through the certifications and they were hitting these kind of core tenets around expectations or on core values, whatever it may be, like, wouldn't I pay 50K for that on the open market? Of course I would, right? And so pre-validating, but with quick certainty. So quarterly, right? So I could move someone BDR one, two, three, then I would move them into a junior path and eventually into a senior. And essentially the way the model worked, and I forget the exact percentages now, it's been a while, but let's say that a typical rep was getting like 20% of gross margin. I basically made it a break even program. The account rep was getting a 1-to-1 ratio with their BDR. So instead of putting them all in a room where like you had a cold calling room with a bunch of just people calling and then distributing the leads, you had a 1-to-1 ratio. So taking the apprentice model. And so some funding from that 1-to-1 ratio was basically taking off that GP and funding this new model. And so it was a break even program essentially that was concurrently building out my new pipeline of top tier talent. And so we ended up putting that, and I mean, in a year, we literally, I'm not exaggerating, doubled revenue from, from 20 something, 25 million to 50 million in revenue just in a year by being able to build out this program. Because not only were we building internal talent, we were also taking those 4 proven sales reps and putting the dedicated kind of BDRs on there, right? Without adding any additional cost, right? And so instead of continuing to hire these 6-figure sales reps that were just coming in, maybe closing a deal, and more often than not costing more than they were, right? And all
Wow.
that made logical sense, right? And I was able to tie that to the financials, right? Because of some of the early work that it is like tying, how do I understand the intrinsic motivation of people, especially Gen Y, and like how do they move fast in their career? How do I tie the financials into things? Like it all came together in that little window, right? And I since then have used that program for operations roles, for engineering roles, right? It obviously doesn't work, as you get further up the food, you can't have infinite vice presidents in a company, right?
Right.
Like earlier career roles or roles with objective inputs where the business can kind of expand somewhat exponentially. It's a really neat, easy to understand program.
Love that. And I love the fact that you took it from what everybody else was doing, which is hire as fast as possible in order to try to grow the business, to what can we do internally to ensure that everybody has what they need in order to succeed. See, it just to me, it sounds like the trappings of that is how you scale, right? So if you're the type of company who knows that they need to grow, clear sounds like a really good opportunity to be able to do that with the things that you just shared. And I love the rewards part at the end too. The fact that they're being rewarded and it gives them an opportunity to move up quickly. So everybody is doing what they can to kind of move up that ladder and they don't have to wait years and years to do it. I think that that's a special key component when it comes to just the life cycle of individuals who you're working with.
No, and I mean, and the transparency, right? I mean, it's, this is almost 10 years ago or over 10 years ago now, right? And we were literally telling people like what were their, the job ladder and the compensation frame, things that we're just as a country barely getting to the surface of now in terms of like sharing compensation bands and things like that. No, you knew exactly like you do this work, you got this next salary, right? And you did the next work. You didn't do the work, you didn't get that salary, right? A complete transparency. So like you did the work. There was no like, I wonder what my salary will be, right? Or if I did, this guy worked a little harder or this lady worked a little harder, like what did they get? Everyone was on the same footing, right? It created parity. And so again, and there were people like we had one guy when we put this in the engineering, he got promoted 4 quarters in a row, right? Now this guy he was putting in the weekends. Like, I mean, again, he was grinding, right? Like, and good for him. There are other people, every other quarter they were getting promoted, right? But then it was completely on them. It removes subjectivity from managers, and biases that creeped in, right? There was a whole bunch of really neat things in there. But, the thing that you hit on there, if you step all the way back, is as a business, when you're scaling, one of the most important things you've got to be thinking about is kind of that chess match. Like, where are you going, right? As a big enterprise company, you do workforce planning and you're thinking about, like, oh, here's what I need for the year and but you've actually at a scale up, right? You've got to be thinking not just like what role do I need in one year? It's actually what do I need a person and how can I think about what a person can be, right? What's their potential? The more that you can think about someone who can move up the ladder, like in a succession type journey, those people are incredibly valuable in a scale up, right? Someone who, again, not to say they have no value of someone who can kind of be a steady Eddie in a scale up, but someone who can actually continue to grow and evolve and you know where they're going to be in 2 years or 1 year or whatever it may be, and putting a path in place, and putting a development plan in place proactively, whether that be leadership or at an individual contributor level, that's really, really important at a scale up that you're doing that with intentionality, right? If you just wait for that to happen organically, not to say it can't happen, but it's really, you've got to be thinking about that. And then the inverse of that as well, right? If you're not thinking about that when you hire someone, let's say you want to hire someone today at a vice president level, and you know that let's say you're a 250 person company, and you know that in the next year and a half you're going to be 500 people or whatever it may be, and that person is probably not going to grow into the vice president of a 500 person or 1,000 person company. You're actually Peter principling that person and creating yourselves all sorts of problems by hiring that person as a vice president. And you're short. Yes, it's like, oh yeah, but they're only going to take the job if they get a vice president title today. Like, and yes, it's really easy to fall into that trap. And again, I've been in multiple scale ups, as you pointed out. Almost always, right? That ends up like whether you promote someone or you hire someone in that vice president who you intrinsically know, or you have more data driven or psychometrics to prove to yourself that that person is not going to scale up with the company. You're actually doing yourself a way bigger disservice when you get to that year and a half mark that you're actually creating for them personally, right? Because you're Peter Principling them, which means you're actually hurting them because you're probably going to have to exit them. Your three things, or two things, right? You're either going to exit them or demote them, which you're almost never going to do. Right? You're probably going to exit them. Then when they get exited, you're probably going to ruin their career to some short window because now they're going to have to go on the market. They're going to interview against other vice presidents that they aren't, right? And so they're going to probably struggle to get their next job. And then they have to take a step down and be like, oh, how do I justify that I'm not really a vice president? I want to be a director again. And be like, oh, why would you want a director job? You're a vice president. So you're going to make their next job search even harder, right? Or they're going to do a certain quality of life and a standard of living and a compensation level, and you're going to make them adjust that, right? You're doing this personal sorts of disservices, right? Then you're creating disruption in your own organization, and or you're also creating worse, right? You may have to like keep this person in there and then introduce an SVP title that you don't need and doing the same thing, right? And then if all of a sudden this role becomes an SVP, the peer role that should be there is now becoming, that should be a VP becomes an SVP, right? And you've layered up your entire organization, which, okay, it's only title, but guess what? Now all of a sudden that VP role becomes an SVP. And guess what? That now they're getting calls for compensation at SVP level. And now you're having to pay that role at an SVP level. And so now all of a sudden your costs and your COGS just went up significantly, right? And your entire cost just went up by 15% because you hired that one person as a vice president and the whole thing just swelled up, right? And understanding the tidal wave effect of all these little decisions that in the moment feel like, oh, that's what we've got to do are really, really critical as you think about skills.
Yeah, I think you just gave a master class of what not to do, of hiring without intentionality. So these words sound great.
Yeah, yeah,
However, I want to ask the question from the other side. So you have the board of directors, you have C-suite, you have CFO, and you have, of course, the founders, the CEOs, right? So there's a level of buy-in that has to happen in order for you to put a framework in place like this. Talk to us a little bit about what you had to do in order to get buy-in for putting in a system in place that will actually help employees grow in the company, show transparency, because to me it's not a normal thing. Some companies, they do have the culture where you can have that level of transparency and everybody's okay with it, but for the
right.
companies that I've experienced, I've only
Yeah,
had one where they were completely open that if you're a director, everybody gets paid as a director. If you are a senior manager, everybody gets paid as a senior manager. That was an anomaly. The company did have less attrition as a result. However, I wasn't there when they had to actually fight the battles to make that
yeah, yeah,
happen. So, it's from perspective, when you look at a system like this, which obviously works, however, how do you get buy-in for something like
yeah.
that?
Yeah, I mean, so the first piece, like stepping a quarter step back, right? Because you hit a keyword, a lot of scale ups, right? Especially if they're venture backed scale ups, and especially when you talk about hyper scale ups. Most hyper scale ups are venture backed, right? That's the nature of like what becomes hyper scale up is probably venture backed because they have some sort of artificial infusion. That's, again, I'm not saying there's no organic based hyper scale up, but more often than not, a hyper scale up is venture backed. Let's talk. There's two types of hyper scale ups, but for my purposes, because most of my experience is venture back, the other type of hyper scale up is a whole different game, which is the what I'll call the bolted on private equity hyper scale up, which is really just where you're merging a whole bunch of different companies. That's a totally different game, and that's a totally different experience. Happy to talk about that. That's a different game entirely. What we're talking about today mostly is the venture based kind of hyperscale.
Mhm.
Most of those cases, especially if you're talking about sub 500 to over 500, you're still with the realm of your founder CEO or your founder leader, right? One of the most important things that I say, and let's actually talk about sequencing here. First and foremost, right, when you're interviewing as a people leader, right, is you've got to find the founder CEO that actually believes as much as you humanly can during the bilateral interview process with a founder that actually believes in human capital as a competitive advantage, right? I mean, so first and foremost, that's as obvious as that sounds, right? Like if you found a founder, and I've been really lucky with pretty much every founder that I've been a part of, really believes that. But I've definitely met some along the way where I've pulled out of the interview process that it's been very clear that they've seen them as kind of, numbers on the spreadsheet, right? Or or kind of means to an end, right? Or disposable assets. And so not nothing I'm saying. A lot of things I say, like to your point, the battles, those are losing battles with the CEO that's like everyone's expendable or whatever it may be. So assuming you've got that kind of founder CEO that believes in human capital as a competitive advantage. The next big thing is that the culture that you're building, or hopefully is somewhat kind of maybe not intentionally, but maybe somewhat organically established, has to match whatever that founder's ability to authentically be present in, right? So if that founder, for instance, is a very direct and transparent, like New York style, I'm going to tell it how it is and whatever, then that should be your culture, right? If your founder is very like a lawyer and holds things close to the vest and like is a private person, what you just described will not work at that company, and that's okay, right? And so one of the things that I really stress is that the culture has to, especially in founder led, like you have to establish a culture that your founder and your CEO can authentically deliver to and live that and hire to that, especially your leadership layer, right? Build to that, performance to that, hire to that, and like don't break to that, right? If, for instance, like here at Cognite, like we have a thing called shipmate self, which is from the Navy, and again, we talk about that often, right? If you have a leader who doesn't follow towards shipmate self, where they put maybe self above ship, right? Like that person will not thrive here at Cognite, and it's really, it goes all the way, Girish, who's our CEO, is a big ship oriented person, right? And so it starts at the top and you've got to have that trickle down. And if one piece of that puzzle breaks, the whole thing kind of falls apart. And so that's really true. So when you talk about like a transparent comp structure or clear whatever, like the CEO founder first, like I've almost every place I built, like I've built different cultures and different kind of speeds even, right? Like you've got it like Cognite is a Norwegian culture at its core, right? We move on a slow has a negative connotation, but like we move and our adapting to change is much slower here than when I was at LoadSmart, right? LoadSmart was Brazilian, very like what we did in the first 6 months at LoadSmart, like we grew from 350 people to 775 people in less than a year, from 6 countries to 21 countries, right? Like we're, kind of had that almost a Latin beat, if you will, right? Like we were able to move faster, right? It's just a different speed and different, and neither is wrong, right? You have to be able to match where like what the company and the culture and organically, and you have to match that to the top, and then your leaders, and then your employees. And in the same way as you don't want a Peter principle at the later, like that VP level, like you don't. Someone might look perfect on paper or my skills and a competency and whatever, like putting a square peg in a round hole, as obvious as this is around culture, but like all your frameworks that you build till your face turns blue will not work if you
Mhm.
have a misalignment of culture, because it'll break the whole thing, because your frameworks and your processes and all these different components theoretically are built on the back of this kind of culture, and culture is such a loaded word, but I mean the best companies in the world have very distinct cultures, right? I mean, you look at like Netflix, for instance, you mentioned like titles, right? Like Netflix doesn't have seniors. They don't have like senior vice president. They have vice president. They don't have senior director. They have director, right? And like that's a very intentional nuance that they get away with there. And it's embedded into their culture, and it's very
Yeah.
much like flat and non-bureaucratic and non-political, right? Other places you get rewarded by moving through these micro progressions, right?
Mm.
Again, neither are wrong, right? It's just like how do I figure out what makes sense in that universe, right? What is a reward at that company? What's interesting at that company? And then hire people also who are incented. So like for instance, I have all sorts of silly ways of kind of breaking down things, like people come to work for one of 5 C's, I call them, right? So they compensation, career, contentment, community, or cause, right? So contentment's kind of like, hey, like not literally always government jobs, but kind of like, hey, peace, balance, whatever. Communities, kind of like the people that I work with. Cause, generally like a nonprofit, right? And obviously comp and career is like It could be a title, it could be the type of work I'm doing, et cetera. Generally, a company can be really, really good at one of those 5 things. It's hard to be amazing at 2 of those things, right?
Mhm.
And so as a company, you also want to pick like which of those things am I going to be exceptional at and not try to be, and then like if you're going to, for instance, say, I'm going to be exceptional at cause. It's like my mom is a CEO of a nonprofit. Like, I can almost assure you that, like, they do not pay the highest, but they are like, their cause is amazing, and they impact children with disabilities all over Central Florida, like, and that's how they pitch people to come work for them and make a big impact that way. Like, if all of a sudden they try to pitch people on, like, "Hey, come here for money," and like, it would just be so incongruous, and if the people that they were trying to attract were these coin-operated people, and that's how they felt kind of, in the same way as, like, love languages, right? Like, the people, it'd be a mismatch, right? So you have to hire people who are also aligned there because otherwise, when they wake up and feel their kind of their love language, their company love language, if you will, was not being met with, then they wouldn't match up. So you have to find what are you exceptional at and then make sure you're also hiring people if you're saying career instead of compensate. Let's say you're paying to the 50th percentile to the 75th percentile. Don't go hire people that are coin operated and looking for high compensation as their main mechanism for reward and recognition. No, it's got to be stretch projects or whatever. And again, let's say you have a flat hierarchical titling system, right? Cool. Don't find people who are looking for titling as their main reward mechanism, whatever it may be, right?
Mhm.
And again, these are back to the scale up conversations. The earlier as a company that you can establish these disciplines, the earlier you can hire kind of ahead of people with some level of strategy. And I've seen, it's funny. I think the pendulum is still oscillating a little bit. Prior to COVID, I found like I would get these calls when like companies were like 700 people and they're like, oh my God, it's way too late. Like we need a head of people. Like we waited too long. Right. And then like COVID, I was getting these calls when people are like, hey, we're 75 people. I think we need a chief people officer now. It's like, no, no, it's too early. You're too soon, too soon. I feel like now people are calling around the right level, which again, arbitrarily is probably like the Series B, Series C. Like when you're crossing around like 200, 300 people, I think that's around the right time. But the earlier you can do, because it's harder to untangle, right? Because like we talked about, right? If you have a bunch of directors and vice presidents running around, like you can't really demote them, right? That's a very hard conversation to have with someone. But the sooner that you can get in the front of things and create some discipline, create some structure and order, create some protocols that become your framework, and again, you hold the ground, then everyone you hire to that, and equally important, don't hire to that, right? Allows that scaling journey to be significantly less painful.
Yeah, see, what I love about what you're saying, we always consider it in the background, but the culture is critically important.
Right.
So building structure and building that culture, which includes everything that we do as a business from the top down, will filter out people who don't belong there. One, two, bring the type of talent that you want in the door because you've defined a culture. And then lastly, if you want to accelerate, the only way you do that, the culture has to be built early on. So
Right.
if you're trying to build a culture after the people are in, then you risk being able to accelerate because at some point this culture problem has to be solved so that you can continue to bring people in. Now that's what I've gathered based off of what you were saying.
No, 100%. Well, because the other big thing that happens in this journey, and again, it's arbitrarily, right? And again, it happens at different stages for different companies, right? Is this, and again, very arbitrary. It's this subjective thing. This, you have this, what I call tornado between startup and scale up, right? And it's at a startup, people are rewarded and recognized for being superheroes, right? Wearing multiple hats, running through walls, doing whatever it takes to get things done. At a scale up, right? The difference is now it's about repeatability, about predictability, it's about structure, it's about process, right? If before you were doing, maybe you were doing sales this and you were also running the marketing team and you were also helping a little bit on the ordering the food, right? Whatever it may be. It's like no, no, now you're just running the marketing team. And because before you only had 15 hours in marketing and 20 hours in sales and 5 hours to order the food stuff, like now it's like cool, you have 40 hours to do marketing. Now if this was good enough before in marketing, now you better do this good in marketing. Well, before we were telling you how amazing you were, but like now you're doing the same level of quality in marketing as you were before, but no, no, you should actually be doing 3x as good as you were, and you're like, wait a minute, why am I not being recognized? So like people coming through that tornado who either they like the task switching of getting to wear a bunch of different hats, or they like kind of the uncertainty, or they don't want to do the orderly, again, salespeople who don't want to have to worry about getting their forecasting clarity or whatever it may be, right? Like most people who like kind of the less than 100 people generally don't like being at a 300 person plus company, right? Not saying nobody, but like a lot of people, the things that they like about the less than 100 person company, they don't like about, and I'm arbitrarily picking these numbers, right? And so again, how with humility and empathy do you find the people in the right place to do that? And private equity does a really good job of creating kind of modality across their portfolios. As you mentioned, one of the things I was doing right before this was I had been part of an early stage kind of founding team of starting a venture capital firm with the former head of the venture arm at BlackRock. And one of the things we were building was a similar internal mobility platform where, again, at some threshold, right, we knew that a founding team that was part of a seed stage, right? If you were one of the first 5 people on a founding team, at some point you wanted to probably get out of there. And how did we keep that kind of internal mobility within the venture portfolio in the same way private equity does? And some venture firms do a pretty good job at that. But again, we were looking at doing that with a much more intentional way than I think a lot of them do. But again, as a company, right, how do you make sure that you're preparing people for that journey proactively and setting those expectations? And again, unfortunately, at some point though, it does take difficult conversations because again, you can't just like have this person floating around, doing subpar work because now like they have a different bar than everyone else just because they were part of the early stage team. Again, at some point, right, there's going to be animosity towards that as well. And right, you mentioned at the very, very beginning, there's also the difficult conversations. And unfortunately, as anyone who's been in HR knows, more often than not, those difficult conversations have to happen sooner than anyone wants them to happen. And I mean, again, I've almost got 20 years under my belt. I have never, ever had a manager come to me after we've made a kind of a performance based exit and said, "Oh man, I wish we had waited a little bit longer." Right? It's always, "Man, we should have done that sooner." And people kind of coming out the other side of that tornado and getting us faster towards the structure and the process and the repeatability and the predictability. Again, and because there's another stage after scale up, which is kind of this what I'll call enterprise ready stage, right? Which is even more rigidity in structure. So it's not full, you want to keep some of the agility at the scale up stage that got you there, right? It's not going full kind of, you're not going full bureaucratic mode at that point. But again, it takes, you can't no longer just be like, I'm going to run through walls and be kind of a renegade at that point. And that's
Mhm.
really hard for some people to accept because again, they spent the first X number of years being told how amazing they are for being a superhero and running through walls and doing whatever it takes. And one day they woke up and people are like, no, stop doing that. Like stay over here in your corner and stay in this box. And no, don't go and order the food. Don't step on that person's toes. Like we need you over here. Like, and hey, by the way, you're not doing a good job over here, even though you're doing the same level of quality that you have been doing for the last 2 years when you've been told you're exceeding expectations or whatever performance rubric you would
Yeah. If you are a founder and you're listening to this conversation, this should give you some really good insight into what the future looks like when you actually start scaling. I mean, Brad is breaking down the psychology of what's happening with the organization, as well as what individuals are thinking about when they scale. It's almost like when we see this term all the way, it's what got you there may not get you to where you want to be because that was needed at the initial phase where you had to wear multiple hats and do different things. But as you start scaling, you need more rigidity and more structure because we're looking for repeatability, not for the ingenuity in trying to come up with how do we get more market share. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, Brad, but to me, that distinction is critical for people to understand. So these are the good times, right? The stuff that we were just talking about, expanding and growing and actually trying to think about your org structure as you're scaling up. But when you use the term internal mobility, I was thinking, well, when do you have to change the organization? What if you realize that a branch is not working at all? and we need to actually make some workforce transition. So why don't you talk to us from, it's almost interesting, right? In order for a plant or a tree to flourish, it does have to get pruned once in a
Sure.
while.
Yeah.
So, what does that pruning look like when these companies realize, okay, I made it here, but in order for me to get to my next level, there's some pruning that needs to happen?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think around that where I think it was done with the most in the most intentionality in my career. So Altasource, we'd sold off a number of components there. In a divestiture strategy that was really about focus and velocity, and that was probably the most, if you in the literalist sense of pruning. Again, where if I think about throughout my career, there's been smaller, kind of more clippings, but that's the biggest version of it. But I think the theme there on pruning, and because there's two types of there's the proactive pruning and the hey, it's too late now, we actually have to pull out the scissors or the shears, if you will, is again, how do you create focus and velocity, right? And again, the letters in series rounds are all screwed up. And now these days, so like I used to have more clarity around like, oh, a series B means, this means we're getting our proof of concept. Series C means this. Series D means we're expanding within our market. And now everything's all topsy turvy. So I don't have as much clear guidance on that anymore. That said, right, a lot of times, like, when you're going into a portfolio review, being able to say no or being able to say, "Hey, we need to shut down this product," in terms of like how much not only literal dollars and whether it be human capital, whether it be cloud costs, whatever else is going into it are going into it, but also again all the ancillary costs, right? Which again, a lot of founders don't. They look at the spreadsheet version of it, but like how much time is the founder or the CEO or the CFO or all the other components that are being dragged, and again, it might be not microscopic, it might be a few hours a week or a month even, right? But again, additively, right, what are the hidden costs that go into some of these distracting, again, whether it be a product, a feature, a unit completely, right? And so a lot of times, first and foremost, it's like, how do I, is that driving us towards back to this idea of the chess match? Like, where are we going, right? Where is the bet that we're making that has the longest kind of term there, right? And so if you take a half a step back from there, then we'll go back to that side of the journey. Ideally, before you get into that situation, and it's funny, I was just talking to a really good friend of mine who's exceptional at this. Ideally, you're living in a land of MVPs, right? You're getting quick signals, and you're able to, instead of launching whole products and bringing them to market and then seeing how it plays out, where you have to then go and cut teams or individuals or whole units, right? You're able to take a more experimentation and MVP kind of driven approach where you can get quicker signals, and then the kind of the decisions to cut or stop are much easier than, hey, now we're already down this path, and it's like there's more emotions and different like components, and like someone's fighting for it, right? Versus like, oh, hey, the signals are pretty clear, we shouldn't move forward with this, or this is a clearer signal, or whatever it may be. That said,
Mhm.
when you are here, right, again, this is where, in the same way as when you think about kind of talent from a kind of parity standpoint, if you have a really clear skills and competency framework and job family methodology, if you're able, let's say, for instance, you've got a unit here in a technology company with like a product team and an engineering team and a sales, and you're evaluating them consistently through a talent review process on the same competencies and skills framework as you are the rest of the product. And then you're able to actually say, hey, great, we actually have a hypo here, right? And so now you can bifurcate out or trifurcate out.
When you say hypo, you mean high potential.
High potential, yes, sorry. So
Okay.
you might have someone who's like a really exceptional product manager who might be on just this team, this product that for whatever reason, or this unit, right? This complete, like we had some divestitures at Altasource where we actually pulled out, like ironically, we had one of our startup entities at Altasource where we pulled out the president of the unit, promoted him to the COO of the whole company, before we closed out the entire unit itself, right? So you can actually pull out top performers if you're able to evaluate people kind of objectively across on the same scale, right? But that's where it's important you're able to look at things kind of somewhat uniformly. Whereas if you're looking at each unit, or you don't have a clear kind of, again, I like things to be simple, right? It's kind of simple way, consistent, somewhat objective way of evaluating and talking about your talent. Because then you can look at Bob and Susie somewhat consistently. And on that same note, and just because it's an easy ism along the way, right? Ideally, the way you're evaluating your internal talent is the same way that you're looking at your external talent, right? When you're interviewing people, you're using the same guides and your same competencies and skills framework. More often than not, when I talk to people, the way that candidates are being interviewed and the kind of the behavioral questions, if there are any, don't even match up at all to the way that promotions are being evaluated. And ideally, that framework and that kind of whole system and methodology should be, if not identical, because there's obviously more data on the inside that you have than the external where you have to go collect references. But other than that, it should be almost identical. And so, again, getting an organization mature around understanding that allows you, when you're making these decisions, to, again, bifurcate out, hey, this business from a financial standpoint, from a distractionary standpoint, because again, we have limited hours, dollars, cash constraints, whatever it may be, right? What's driving the decision to prune, in your words, right? Then what do we do with the human capital? And then the third piece is like, again, where, and this is where, whether it be like, and it's funny, probably the place I did this the most with AdCap, when we ran this program I told you about with Clear, the first time we ran it, it didn't get a lot of publicity, but by the third iteration, I'm not exaggerating, for the engineering version, I think we had somewhere north of 2,000 applicants that came through. I mean, it was just, it was a huge thing. And I literally like, and we only hired, I think, 2 people on it. Like 2 out of 2,000, right? And we had some really incredible people come through. And I literally offered to all of our local competitors, I'm like, hey guys, I will give you the playbook. I will give you like the candidates, like here. Like I feel bad. There's, again, it wasn't, not 1998 weren't a good, but there was probably at least 20, 30 of them that were, hireable for sure, not more. And I'm telling you, not one of our competitors took them, not one. And I
Mhm.
was, because it took, to your very earlier point on, like, it takes the right company and the right CEO and whatever, like they weren't, none of them were ready for it. But again, like I'm a believer, if I am going to make it, it's like, I know who my competitors are. I can also call them and be like, hey, I got some good people here. Like to me, it's, the world is small, right? It's like, again, if one of my hobbies, I referee basketball, and basketball is a funny one because when you go and you try out for the NBA or for college or whatever it may be, right? You're on a court with 2 other guys or ladies or combination, right? And you're all going for the same job. And it's a really cool profession because the way to go get a job in the NBA or as a college, right, is all 3 of you, even though there might be only one job, all 3 of you have to look good, right? If one of you stands out because you're calling all over the place or you're upstaging the other ones, whatever, you actually look worse, right? The
Mm.
cohesiveness of that crew is one of the signals, no pun intended, of a good official, right? And so, to me, I'm a big believer, and it goes back to the theater degree, right? And there's so many transposable things across things, but the same thing's true too, right? I can give someone my top talent, and if we're doing a great job as a company, they can go do a great job too. Then lots of room for companies to be successful, right? And again, it's amazing how many people don't take these calls. I mean, I share top talent often, and I'm not saying never has anyone taken them, but again, I'm a believer in kind of karma, move things forward, and again, I've got lots of great friendships because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been wonderful. Just listening to how you talk about the different situations that happen associated with scaling, and then individually what's happening when you have to make these tough decisions of moving a department, pruning, making sure that you're being very intentional about how you structure people in an organization. It's refreshing to hear. To me, I always think that a lot of this is being said but not done. But I believe, based off of what you're saying, is that if you want to survive in the PE world, or if you want to survive in the startup and scale up world, you need to know how to do this well. It's not an afterthought, it's something that you have to organize and think about at the very beginning. So, before we end this, is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience based off of the context of what we talked about?
No, I mean, we've used the word intentional a lot today, and I think that's the most important thing, I think, of scale up, right? There's intentionality, and to do things intentional requires a pause, right? And so a lot of times I think HR, especially, and especially bad HR, can be disruptive, right? It can be a blocker, right? It stops you in your tracks. I gotta do this HR program, I gotta fill out this performance review, right? But good HR, good people practices should be a pause, right? It actually requires you to stop in what you're doing. But the difference of a pause versus a disruptor is from that pause should come a velocity, right? It's like I'm with that intention, I'm pausing, I'm thinking about, again, it could be the next month, could next year, it could be 2 years down the road. Pause, think, play the chess match out. I mean, again, AI, to your point earlier, allows you to plug and stress test things in a way that is almost magic. I mean, you couldn't, it's mind blowing what you can do with AI to stress test ideas and kind of debate not only amongst yourselves, but now with Claude. But with that pause comes with velocity, right? Again, I don't
Mm.
know. I've got kids, so they play Mario Kart, right? I think about the little accelerator thing on Mario Kart, right? It's like out of that pause, the little arrow that, it's like
Oh.
that's what a good pause coming out of there should be. And so that said, what is experience? Experience is either just making mistakes or being around people who have made them. So it's okay to make some mistakes around the way. It's just get up and do it again. So it's have fun and be human.
I absolutely love that. So I want to thank you, Brad, for being a genuinely honest about what works, what doesn't work, and candidly speaking about the challenges that we see in the space of scaling up companies. And for the rest of you, if you want to get access to Brad, you'll be able to see his information in the show notes. And if you are going through a workforce transition or you're a company who had to make the hard decision to actually support your executives by letting them go, we also have a program that allows us to help the individuals get hired on the other side. So if you have a strong culture and you believe in the people that you've hired, but you still want to help them on exit, hit us up at referenceme.ai. Look forward to talking with you. Thank you. And thank you, Brad.
Thank you.